Hi, I'm Riley. My father built a tech empire worth $200 million. Corner offices, private jets, board meetings with Fortune 500 executives. When I came home from my third deployment in Afghanistan, my family looked at me and said, "Your service was cute, but this is the real world now. Make yourself useful around the house." Then my stepmother whispered, "Don't embarrass your father's reputation with your military stories." So I didn't argue. I cleaned in silence. I served in shadows. And when his CEO shook my hand at the partnership ceremony, calling me the most strategic mind he'd ever encountered, their jaws hit the marble floor. You ever realize your own family saw your Purple Heart as a participation trophy, while strangers saw your potential as priceless? Stick around. I'll show you what quiet brilliance looks like when it finally gets the stage it deserves. Preparing and narrating this type of story took us long efforts and hard work. So if you are enjoying the story, please consider subscribing to our channel before we dive deep. What time are you watching this and where are you from? Drop a comment below. I read every single one and your stories fuel these videos. The ceramic mug slipped from my fingers, shattering against the pristine kitchen tiles of the Blackstone estate. Coffee splattered across the imported Italian marble like brown paint, on a canvas nobody wanted. I was reaching for the paper towels when I heard the sharp click of designer heels approaching from the main foyer. "Seriously, Riley?" Victoria's voice sliced through the morning air like a scalpel through silk. "It's a coffee mug. You've been handling military equipment for 6 years. How hard can basic housework be?" I knelt down, collecting the ceramic. Pieces with steady hands that had once defused improvised explosive devices in Kandahar. The irony wasn't lost on me, but I kept my mouth shut. Victoria Blackstone, my stepmother of 3 years, had perfected the art of making observations that cut deeper than any shrapnel I'd encountered overseas. "Sorry," I muttered, dropping the fragments into my palm. "I'll replace it." She stood there, arms crossed, watching me clean up the mess like I was a hired help who'd just proved why she shouldn't be trusted with the good china. Her blonde hair was pulled back in that perfect chignon she wore to all of Dad's corporate events, the one that cost more than most people's monthly rent. Everything about Victoria screamed money and status, from her silk blouse to her perfectly manicured nails that had never touched anything more challenging than a champagne flute. "Don't bother replacing it," she said, her tone suggesting I couldn't afford to anyway. "That set was a wedding gift from the Rothschild family. Just stick to the everyday dishes from now on." The everyday dishes. As if I was the live-in domestic staff rather than Dad's daughter. I finished cleaning the spill and disposed of the broken pieces, while Victoria retreated to her morning routine of yoga and green smoothies. The house fell quiet except for the distant hum of the pool filter and the soft tick of the grandfather clock in the hallway. Dad had already left for the office, as he did every morning at exactly 7:15, driving his silver Bentley down the winding driveway like he was fleeing a crime scene. This had become my reality for the past 4 months since returning from Afghanistan. After 6 years of military service, 3 deployments, and a Purple Heart for taking shrapnel while evacuating wounded civilians, I was now essentially Victoria's unpaid housekeeper. The transition from leading tactical operations to folding laundry felt like falling off a cliff in slow motion. The morning sun streamed through the floor-to-ceiling windows, illuminating dust particles that danced in the air like tiny soldiers, in formation. I found myself watching them, remembering how sunlight used to filter through the canvas walls of our base camp, how it caught the dust kicked up by helicopters landing with supply drops. Those memories felt like scenes from someone else's life now. My phone buzzed against the granite countertop, a text from Marcus, my former squad leader who'd gotten out 6 months before me. "How's civilian life treating you? Still adjusting to sleeping in a real bed?" I stared at his message for a long moment. How could I explain that sleeping in a real bed was the least of my adjustments? That I'd traded the respect of my fellow soldiers for being treated like invisible help in my own father's house? That the woman who'd never served a day in her life now spoke to me like I was an inconvenience she tolerated out of obligation? Instead, I typed back, "Getting there. Different kind of challenges." Marcus responded immediately. "You find work? Yet? There's a security consulting firm in Denver looking for someone with your background. Want me to send you the contact info?" I set the phone down without responding. The truth was, I hadn't seriously looked for work yet. Part of me had hoped that coming home would mean reconnecting with Dad, maybe even finding a place in his company. Blackstone Technologies had started as a small software firm when I was in high school, but Dad's vision and relentless drive had transformed it into a major player in cybersecurity and data analytics. I'd watched from a distance as it grew, through letters and video calls from various military bases around the world. The irony was that my military experience had given me exactly the kind of strategic thinking and security expertise his company specialized in. But Dad seemed to view my service as a phase I'd gone through, like a college major that hadn't quite worked out. Something to be politely acknowledged but not seriously considered as preparation for anything meaningful. The sound of heels clicking across the foyer interrupted my thoughts. Victoria reappeared, now dressed in tennis whites, her yoga mat tucked under one arm. "I'm meeting the charity board at the club this afternoon," she announced, not really speaking to me so much as informing the general vicinity of her plans. "They're discussing the annual fundraiser for veterans' rehabilitation programs. Ironic, isn't it?" She paused, waiting for me to ask what was ironic about it. When I didn't take the bait, she continued anyway. "Here we are, raising money to help veterans transition back to civilian life, and I have one right here who can't even handle breakfast duties without causing a catastrophe." The words hit like a slap, but I kept my expression neutral. In the military, we called it maintaining, bearing under fire. The principle applied whether the incoming rounds were bullets or verbal ammunition designed to break you down. "The house phone might ring around noon," Victoria continued, checking her reflection in the hallway mirror. "If it's someone from your father's office, take a message. Don't try to be helpful and transfer calls or give out information. You don't understand the business well enough to represent the company properly. Don't understand the business well enough." I'd spent 3 years studying cybersecurity in my spare time between deployments, earning certifications that most of Dad's junior employees would kill for. I'd consulted on information security protocols for military operations involving millions of dollars of equipment and thousands of lives. But apparently, I couldn't be trusted to take a phone message. After Victoria left for her tennis match, I found myself wandering through the house like a ghost haunting familiar territory. The walls were lined with photos documenting Dad's rise in the business world. Pictures of him shaking hands with senators, cutting ribbons at new office openings, accepting awards from industry organizations. There were a few family photos scattered among the professional shots, mostly from before he married Victoria. A picture of him and my mother at some company Christmas party, both of them young and hopeful. A photo of the two of us at my high school graduation, his arm around my shoulders, genuine pride in his smile. I stopped in front of a more recent photo, taken at Dad and Victoria's wedding 3 years ago. I was in my dress uniform, having gotten leave specifically to attend. Victoria looked radiant in her designer gown. Dad looked distinguished in his tuxedo, and I looked like exactly what I was, a soldier trying to fit into a world that had moved on without her. The house felt massive and empty, like a museum dedicated to someone else's success. Every surface was perfectly clean, every decoration carefully chosen by an interior designer who specialized in making rich people's homes look like magazine spreads. It was beautiful and cold, and nothing like the cramped base housing I'd shared with other soldiers, where every conversation mattered and every person had a clearly defined role that contributed to something bigger than themselves. My phone rang, interrupting my tour of nostalgia. The caller ID showed a number I didn't recognize, but the area code was local. "Blackstone residence," I answered, falling into the script Victoria had drilled into me. "Is this Riley Blackstone?" The voice was professional, confident, with a slight accent I couldn't quite place. "Yes, this is Riley. My name is Elena Vasquez. I'm the Chief Operating Officer at Blackstone Technologies. Your father has mentioned you, and I was wondering if you might have time to meet for coffee this week. I have a business proposition. That might interest you?" I nearly dropped the phone the way I'd dropped the coffee mug that morning. Elena Vasquez was legendary in Dad's company, a strategic genius who'd helped engineer some of their biggest acquisitions. She'd been featured on the cover of Forbes as one of the most influential women in tech. And she wanted to meet with me. "Yes, I'd be very interested in meeting with you," I managed to say. "Excellent. How about Thursday at 10? There's a small cafe called Meridian about 10 minutes from your father's house. Do you know it?" I didn't, but I'd find it. "Thursday at 10 works perfectly." "Wonderful. I look forward to our conversation, Riley. I have a feeling it's going to be very productive." After she hung up, I stood in the silent house holding the phone, my mind racing. Why would Elena Vasquez want to meet with me? Did Dad know about this? And most importantly, what kind of business proposition could the COO of a tech empire possibly have for someone Victoria considered barely competent enough to handle housework? The grandfather clock chimed 11 times, marking another hour in what had become an endless cycle of invisible days. But for the first time since coming home, something felt different. There was a spark of possibility in the air, like the moment before dawn when the darkness finally starts to crack. The next morning arrived with the same ritual humiliation disguised as morning routine. Victoria's voice drifted down from the master bedroom at exactly 6:30, calling for her usual breakfast of steel-cut oats with organic blueberries, fresh squeezed orange juice, and coffee, prepared in the French press she'd brought back from her last trip to Paris. Not asked for, demanded, like I was staff whose entire existence revolved around her dietary preferences. I stood in the kitchen, measuring out the oats while listening to her recite her schedule to Dad through their open bedroom door. Pilates at 8, lunch with the hospital board at noon, followed by a shopping appointment with her personal stylist. Dad's responses were muffled, distracted grunts between the rustling of newspaper pages and the clicking of his laptop keys. Even at home, he lived inside his phone and computer, fielding calls and emails like they were incoming artillery. The irony wasn't lost on me that I'd spent 6 years coordinating complex military operations involving hundreds of personnel and millions of dollars in equipment. But now my most challenging task was remembering whether Victoria preferred her coffee at exactly 160 degrees or 165. When I brought the breakfast tray upstairs, Dad was already in his suit, adjusting his tie in the full-length mirror. He glanced at me briefly, the way you might notice a piece of furniture that had been moved slightly out of place. "Morning, Riley. Sleep okay?" It was the same question he asked every day, delivered with the same distracted tone that suggested he wasn't particularly interested in the answer. I'd learned to keep my responses short and generic. Any mention of nightmares or adjustment difficulties only seemed to make him uncomfortable, like I was bringing unnecessary drama into his perfectly ordered world. "Slept fine, thanks." Victoria took the tray without looking at me immediately, checking the temperature of her coffee with a small thermometer she kept on her nightstand. The gesture felt like a performance, a daily reminder that my efforts required verification, that my competence couldn't be assumed. "The oats are a little thick today," she observed, stirring them with surgical precision. "Remember, I prefer them creamy, not gluey. It's really not that complicated." Dad's jaw tightened slightly, the only indication that Victoria's tone bothered him. But he said nothing, just gathered his briefcase and headed for the door. This was how he handled conflict in his personal life, by leaving the room, letting Victoria manage the household dynamics while he focused on business matters he actually cared about controlling. After they both left, I found myself alone in the house again. surrounded by evidence of their successful, busy lives. Victoria's calendar was magneted to the refrigerator, every hour color-coded and accounted for. Dad's home office was a shrine to achievement, walls lined with framed articles about Blackstone technologies, awards from industry organizations, and photos of him speaking at conferences around the world. My own space consisted of the guest bedroom where I'd been staying, furnished with pieces that looked expensive but felt temporary, like hotel furniture chosen more for appearance than comfort. The walls were bare except for a single framed photo of my unit from Afghanistan, 12 faces grinning at the camera despite the desert heat and constant threat of enemy fire. Looking at it now, I could barely remember feeling that sense of purpose, that certainty that what I was doing mattered. The morning stretched ahead like an empty highway. Victoria had left a list of tasks on the kitchen counter, written in her careful handwriting on personalized stationery. Grocery shopping. For tonight's dinner party, dry cleaning pickup, calling the landscaping service about the brown spots on the front lawn. Each item felt designed to keep me busy rather than productive, like homework assigned to a child who needed structure rather than someone capable of making meaningful contributions. I decided to tackle the grocery shopping first, mainly because it got me out of the house. The Whole Foods in Dad's neighborhood was the kind of place where organic kale cost more than most people's lunch, where every shopping cart seemed to contain ingredients for meals that would be photographed before being eaten. I pushed my cart through aisles lined with products that Victoria had trained me to recognize. The specific brand of olive oil she preferred, the artisanal pasta that cost $12 a box, the imported cheese that came with its own authentication certificate. At the checkout, the cashier, a young woman about my age with kind eyes and purple-streaked hair, glanced at the items on the conveyor belt. "Fancy dinner party?" she asked, making conversation while scanning the truffle oil and grass-fed beef tenderloin. "Something like that," I replied, not bothering to explain that I wouldn't be attending the dinner party, just preparing and serving it. She looked at me more carefully, and I wondered what she saw. Someone who looked like she belonged in this expensive neighborhood, shopping for ingredients most people couldn't afford, or someone who seemed out of place among the designer handbags and luxury SUVs. "You live around here?" she asked. "I'm staying with family," I said, which was technically true but felt like a misrepresentation of my actual situation. Cool. Military. She'd noticed the dog tags I still wore under my shirt, a habit I couldn't seem to break despite being out of uniform. "Army. Just got out a few months ago." Her expression shifted, becoming more interested. "My brother's in the Marines. Afghanistan? 3 tours. Damn. Welcome home." She said it like she meant it, not like the polite "thank you for your service" comments I'd gotten used to hearing from people who had no idea what to do with that information. Driving back to the house, I found myself thinking about that brief interaction. How normal it had felt to be seen as myself rather than as an extension of someone else's expectations. The cashier hadn't known about Dad's company or Victoria's social status or the guest bedroom where I slept like a visitor in my own father's house. She'd just seen a veteran buying groceries, and somehow that felt more real than anything else that had happened to me since coming home. The afternoon brought Victoria's dinner party preparations, which meant transforming the formal dining room into something suitable for impressing Dad's business associates and their wives. Crystal glasses that required hand washing, silver that needed polishing, cloth napkins that had to be folded into precise triangular shapes that Victoria had learned from some lifestyle magazine. I was arranging flowers in the centerpiece when Dad came home early, bringing with him a man I recognized from photos in his office. James Morrison, the chief financial officer, tall and silver-haired with the kind of confident bearing that came from decades of making important decisions. They were deep in conversation about quarterly projections as they passed through the foyer. "Riley?" Dad called out, not pausing in his discussion. "Could you bring us some coffee in my office? James, you remember my daughter. She just finished her service in Afghanistan." James glanced at me with the polite interest people showed when being introduced to someone they'd forget within minutes. "Thank you for your service," he said automatically, then immediately returned his attention to Dad. About those regulatory compliance issues we discussed. I brought them coffee and Dad's best china, the same set Victoria wouldn't trust me to use for breakfast. They accepted the cups without looking up from the spreadsheets scattered across Dad's desk, numbers and charts that represented millions of dollars in revenue and thousands of jobs. Standing there, invisible in the middle of their important conversation, I caught fragments of their discussion: market penetration strategies, acquisition targets, cybersecurity protocols that could benefit from military-grade encryption standards. The irony was staggering. They were discussing exactly the kind of security challenges I'd dealt with in the military, problems I could have contributed to solving if anyone had bothered to ask what I'd learned during 6 years of protecting critical infrastructure from sophisticated cyber attacks. But I was just the person who brought coffee, someone to be thanked for my service and then ignored while the real business happened around me. That evening, the dinner party unfolded exactly as Victoria had orchestrated. 8 guests, 4 couples, all dressed in the kind of expensive casual wear that looked effortless but probably cost more than most people's monthly salary. I moved through the evening like a shadow, refilling wine glasses and clearing plates while conversations swirled around topics I wasn't expected to understand: stock options and country club memberships and vacation homes in the Hamptons. Victoria had positioned me as helpful family, someone who pitched in because she was naturally considerate, not because she was being treated like hired help. The guests accepted this explanation without question, probably assuming that military service had instilled in me a desire to be useful, to serve others without expecting recognition. During dessert, one of the wives, a woman named Patricia, whose husband ran a consulting firm, asked me directly about my plans. "So what's next for you, dear? College? Or are you thinking about starting a family?" The question hung in the air like smoke from an expensive cigar. Around the table, 8 successful people waited for my answer, probably expecting something modest and appropriately grateful. I could feel Victoria's eyes on me, silently communicating that this was not the moment for ambition or complexity. "I'm still figuring things out," I said finally, the safest possible response. Patricia nodded sympathetically. "Of course. It must be such an adjustment. Thank goodness you have family to support you while you get back on your feet." Get back on my feet. As if serving my country had knocked me down rather than building me up. As if I needed rescuing rather than opportunity. Thursday morning arrived with the weight of anticipation that made my hands shake slightly as I selected clothes for my meeting with Elena Vasquez. I chose a navy blazer and dark jeans, professional, but not trying too hard. The kind of outfit that could work for coffee with a CEO or grocery shopping afterward. Victoria was at her weekly spa appointment, which meant I could leave the house without explaining where I was going, or defending my right to have plans that didn't revolve around household management. Meridian Cafe turned out to be a small, understated place tucked between a bookstore and a vintage furniture shop, the kind of spot where actual conversations happened rather than social media performances. Elena Vasquez was already seated at a corner table when I arrived, her dark hair pulled back in a simple ponytail, wearing a black sweater that probably cost more than my monthly military allowance, but looked effortlessly elegant rather than flashy. She stood up when she saw me approach, extending her hand with the kind of firm grip that suggested she was used to being taken seriously. "Riley, thank you for meeting me. I hope this place is okay. I prefer coffee shops where we can actually hear each other think." We ordered our drinks, and I found myself studying her face, trying to understand why someone at her level would want to meet with me. Elena had built her reputation by identifying opportunities others missed, by seeing potential where conventional wisdom saw problems. Forbes had called her the strategic mind behind Blackstone's most successful pivots, and here she was, sitting across from me like we were equals. "Your father speaks about you," she began, stirring sugar into her espresso. Though perhaps not in the way you might expect. I felt my stomach tighten. I'm sure he does. He talks about you the way military commanders talk about operations. They're proud of, but don't fully understand. He knows you accomplished something significant, but he can't quite translate it into civilian terms. The observation was so precise it caught me off guard. That's actually a pretty accurate assessment. Elena leaned forward slightly. Tell me about your cybersecurity work in Afghanistan. Not the official version, the real version. For the next 20 minutes, I found myself describing things I hadn't talked about since debriefing sessions with my commanding officers. The late nights spent analyzing network intrusions, the satisfaction of developing countermeasures that protected critical communications, the chess game of anticipating enemy tactics and staying 3 moves ahead. Elena listened with the kind of focused attention I'd forgotten existed, asking technical questions that proved she understood exactly what I was talking about. The challenge we're facing at Blackstone, she said finally, is that our cybersecurity protocols were designed for traditional corporate threats, but the landscape is changing rapidly. We need someone who understands asymmetric warfare, who can think like an adversary rather than just building bigger walls. I set down my coffee cup carefully. Are you offering me a job? I'm offering you a conversation about possibilities. But first, I need to understand something. Why are you living at your father's house instead of building your own career? The question hung between us like a challenge. I could have given her the safe answer, something about family obligations and transitional periods. Instead, I found myself telling the truth. Because they don't see me. They see someone who needs to be managed. Someone whose service was admirable, but not actually useful in the real world. And somewhere along the way, I started believing them. Elena nodded slowly. Richard is brilliant at building companies, but he's terrible at recognizing talent that doesn't fit his existing framework. He missed promoting our best analyst for 3 years because she didn't look like what he expected. Leadership to look like. She pulled out her phone and showed me a photo from what looked like a corporate retreat. Dad was in the center, surrounded by his senior team, all of them smiling at the camera in that practiced way of successful executives. They looked confident, accomplished, like people who belonged in boardrooms and made decisions that mattered. This was taken last month at our strategic planning session, Elena said. Notice anything about this group? I studied the photo more carefully. Dad looked proud and authoritative, every inch the successful CEO. His team looked diverse in some ways. Different. Ages, a few women, someone who might have been Latino. But there was something homogeneous about them too. A sameness in their expressions and bearing that suggested they all came from similar backgrounds, had similar educational experiences, thought about problems in similar ways. They all look like they went to the same business school, I said finally. Exactly. And that's our weakness. We're all solving problems the same way, seeing opportunities through the same lens. We need someone who thinks differently. My phone buzzed with a text message. Without thinking, I glanced at the screen. It was from Victoria. Pick up dry cleaning before 4 p.m. Don't forget the organic chicken for tonight's dinner. Also, the landscaper called about brown spots. Handle it. Elena noticed my expression change. Everything okay? I turned the phone face down on the table. Just household logistics. Household logistics, Elena repeated, and something in her tone made me look up. Riley, can I ask you something personal? I nodded. When you were leading operations in Afghanistan, did anyone ever interrupt your mission briefings to remind you to pick up dry cleaning? The question was so absurd it made me laugh, but the laugh came out hollow. Of course not. Then why are you accepting that treatment now? Before I could answer, my phone rang. Dad's name appeared on the screen, and I felt that familiar tightening in my chest that came with his unexpected calls. I should take this, I said to Elena, then answered. Hi, Dad. Riley, where are you? Victoria said you left the house this morning without mentioning your plans. The casual assumption that I needed to account for my whereabouts hit me like a physical blow. I'm having coffee with someone. With who? Is everything all right? There was genuine concern in his voice, but it was the kind of concern you'd show for a teenager who'd missed curfew, not an adult daughter who'd spent 6 years making life-or-death decisions independently. Everything's fine, Dad. I'll be home soon. Okay. Victoria was worried when she couldn't reach you. Next time, maybe leave a note or send a text. After I hung up, Elena was watching me with an expression I couldn't quite read. How old are you, Riley? 28. And how old were you when you first deployed to Afghanistan? 22. She leaned back in her chair. So at 22, the United States Army trusted you to protect critical infrastructure in a combat zone. But at 28, your family needs to know where you are when you leave the house for coffee. The parallel was so stark, it left me speechless. Elena reached across the table and picked up my phone, which was still face up after Dad's call. Sue. She asked, gesturing toward the screen. I nodded, and she scrolled through the recent messages. Victoria's reminders about household tasks, Dad's brief check-ins that felt more like management than conversation, a few texts from military friends that I'd responded to with increasingly generic updates about civilian life being fine. This isn't a family, Riley, Elena said quietly, setting the phone back down. This is an organization chart where you've been assigned to the bottom tier, and you're so grateful to be included at all that you're not questioning whether you belong there. The words hit like shrapnel, sharp and unexpected. I found myself thinking about the dinner party 2 nights ago, how I'd moved through the evening like a ghost, serving people who were discussing exactly the kind of work I was qualified to do. How Patricia had assumed I needed to get back on my feet, while I refilled her wine glass with hands that had once assembled encrypted communication systems under enemy fire. The position I'm considering, Elena continued, would involve leading a new cybersecurity division. It would mean working directly with government contracts, developing protocols for protecting sensitive data, building teams of analysts who think like you do. The salary would be competitive with what we pay senior directors. I stared at her, feeling like someone had just offered me oxygen after months of slowly suffocating. Why me? You could hire anyone. Because anyone else would see a cybersecurity job. You would see a mission. As we left the cafe, Elena handed me her business card. Think about it. But while you're thinking, ask yourself this question. If you were still in the military and a commanding officer treated you the way your family treats you, what would you do? Driving back to Dad's house, her question echoed in my mind. In the eye, military respect was earned through competence and dedication, not granted through bloodlines or social connections. If a superior had consistently undermined my abilities or treated my expertise as irrelevant, I would have requested a transfer or filed a formal complaint. I wouldn't have accepted it as the natural order of things. But somehow, in civilian life, I'd convinced myself that gratitude was more appropriate than self-respect, that being included was better than being valued. The drive home from Meridian Cafe felt different, like I was seeing the neighborhood through new eyes. The manicured lawns and imposing gates that had once represented success now looked like barriers designed to keep certain people in their assigned places. Elena's business card sat on the passenger seat, a small rectangle of possibility that seemed to radiate more warmth than the entire Blackstone estate. When I pulled into the circular driveway, Victoria's white Mercedes was already there, which meant she'd returned from her spa appointment earlier than usual. I found her in the kitchen, sorting through mail with the focused intensity she usually reserved for charity board meetings and social climbing opportunities. There you are, she said without looking up. How was your mysterious coffee date? The way she said mysterious made it sound vaguely scandalous, like I'd been engaging in behavior that required supervision. It was fine. Just catching up with someone. Someone from the military? Victoria's tone suggested that military connections were automatically suspect. People who might encourage inappropriate ideas about my future prospects. A business contact, I said, which was technically true, but felt like a small act of rebellion. Victoria paused in her mail sorting, finally, looking at me directly. Riley, you know I only want what's best for you, but you need to be realistic about your options. The military was a wonderful experience, I'm sure, but civilian careers require different skills, different connections. Your father has worked very hard to build his reputation in this community, and we need to be thoughtful about how you present yourself. Present yourself, as if my entire identity was a marketing campaign that needed careful management to avoid damaging the family brand. What exactly are you worried about? I asked. Victoria set down the mail and leaned against the granite countertop, adopting the patient expression she used when explaining obvious truths to people who were being deliberately obtuse. Sweetheart, you can't just waltz into the business world expecting people to understand military experience. It's a different culture, different expectations. You need to start small, maybe administrative work or customer service. Build your way up gradually. Show people you can adapt to civilian norms. Administrative work. Customer service. Building up gradually from positions that would utilize exactly none of the skills I'd developed leading complex operations in hostile environments. Victoria's vision of my future involved decades of proving myself worthy of basic respect, accepting entry-level treatment as the price for being allowed to participate in the grown-up world. My phone buzzed with a text message. Elena's name appeared on the screen. Hope you made it home safely. When you're ready to discuss next steps, I'm here. Also, attached is a link to an article about military veterans and cybersecurity leadership. Thought you might find it interesting. I opened the link while Victoria returned to her mail. The article featured profiles of former military personnel who'd transitioned into senior technology roles, people who'd leveraged their security clearances and tactical thinking into corporate leadership positions. The photographs showed confident professionals in boardrooms and conference centers, people who looked like they belonged in conversations about strategy and innovation. What's that? Victoria asked, noticing my engagement with the phone. Just an article about career transitions, I said. She glanced at the screen over my shoulder, and I watched her expression shift as she processed what she was seeing. These weren't stories about veterans gratefully accepting entry-level positions and slowly earning their way up corporate ladders. These were stories about people who'd walked directly into executive roles because their military experience was seen as an asset, not a liability requiring rehabilitation. Well, Victoria said carefully, I suppose there are always exceptions. But you have to understand, those people probably had family connections or special circumstances. The reality for most people is much more gradual. Family connections. The irony was breathtaking. I was literally the daughter of a tech CEO, but Victoria couldn't imagine that connection working in my favor because she couldn't see my military service as preparation for anything meaningful. That evening, Dad came home late, as usual, carrying his briefcase and the distracted energy of someone whose mind was still processing spreadsheets and strategic plans. He found me in the living room, reading through Elena's article for the third time. How was your day? He asked, settling into his leather armchair with the mechanical precision of a man following an established routine. Productive, I said. I had an interesting meeting about career opportunities. Dad looked up from his phone, giving me his attention in a way that felt unfamiliar. Oh? What kind of opportunities? Cybersecurity consulting. Someone who thinks my military background might be relevant. He paused, and I could see him trying to process this information through his existing framework for understanding my situation. That's ambitious. Are you sure you're ready for something that technical? It's a pretty specialized field. Ready. As if I hadn't spent years protecting classified communication systems from sophisticated cyber attacks. as if I hadn't earned multiple certifications in network security and data protection. Dad knew these facts about my service record, but somehow he couldn't connect them to current job market realities. "I think I might be more ready than you realize," I said quietly. Dad set his phone aside completely, which almost never happened, during our conversations. "Riley, I don't want you to get your hopes up unnecessarily. The tech industry is extremely competitive, and most entry-level positions require specific educational backgrounds or internship experience. Maybe you should consider starting with something more accessible, building up your civilian resume gradually." There was that word again. Gradually. As if my 6 years of military service had been a detour that required correction rather than an accelerated education in leadership and crisis management. My phone rang, interrupting our conversation. Elena's name appeared on the screen, and I felt a surge of gratitude for the timing. "Excuse me," I said to Dad, then answered. "Hello, Elena." "Riley, I hope I'm not calling too late. I wanted to follow up on our conversation today because something came up that might interest you. We just received a contract proposal from the Department of Defense for upgrading their communication security protocols. It's exactly the kind of project that would benefit from someone with your background." I could feel Dad watching me, probably trying to interpret my side of the conversation. "That does sound interesting. The timeline is aggressive, and we'd need someone who could hit the ground running, someone who understands both the technical requirements and the operational context. Would you be available to come in tomorrow afternoon to discuss the details?" "Yes, absolutely. Excellent. And, Riley? Bring copies of your security clearance documentation and any technical certifications you earned during your service. This isn't a conversation about whether you're qualified. It's a conversation about how quickly you can start." After I hung up, Dad was staring at me with an expression I'd never seen before. Not the polite concern he usually showed, but something that looked almost like curiosity. "Was that about the cybersecurity position you mentioned?" "Yes. There's a Department of Defense contract they want to discuss with me." Dad leaned forward in his chair. "A DoD contract? That's significant work. Those contracts typically go to senior-level consultants. Apparently, they think I might be qualified." For a moment, the living room fell completely silent, except for the soft tick of the grandfather clock in the hallway. Dad looked at me like he was seeing something he'd missed before, trying to reconcile the person sitting across from him with his assumptions about my capabilities and prospects. "Who is this Elena person?" he asked finally. "Elena Vasquez. She's the COO at a tech consulting firm." Dad's expression changed completely. "Elena Vasquez? She's one of the most respected strategists in the industry. If she's interested in working with you." He trailed off, apparently trying to process implications he hadn't considered before. Victoria appeared in the doorway, drawn by the unusual energy of our conversation. "What's all the excitement about?" "Riley has a meeting tomorrow about a Defense Department consulting contract," Dad said, and there was something in his voice that sounded almost like pride. Victoria's smile faltered slightly. "That's wonderful, dear. I'm sure it will be a good learning experience." A learning experience. Even when presented with evidence that I might be qualified for significant professional responsibilities, Victoria couldn't quite let go of the narrative that positioned me as someone who needed to be educated rather than someone who had expertise to offer. But Dad was looking at me differently now, like he was trying to solve a puzzle he'd been missing pieces to. And for the first time since coming home, I felt like maybe the person he was starting to see was closer to the person I actually was. Friday morning arrived with the familiar sound of Victoria's heels clicking across the marble foyer, but everything felt different. I was sitting at the kitchen table with my laptop open, reviewing technical documentation for my afternoon meeting with Elena, when Victoria swept in carrying her yoga mat and a green smoothie that probably cost more than most. People's lunch. "You're up early," she observed. setting her smoothie on the counter with the careful precision of someone who'd never cleaned up her own spills. "I thought you might sleep in since you don't have any real responsibilities today." The words hit. Differently than they had just a week ago. Real responsibilities. As if preparing for a Department of Defense contract discussion was somehow less legitimate than Victoria's morning routine of Pilates and charity board meetings. "Actually, I have a meeting this afternoon about a consulting project," I said, not looking up from my screen. Victoria moved closer, peering at my laptop with the kind of invasive curiosity she usually reserved for examining household staff references. "Oh, that's nice, dear. What kind of consulting? Administrative support? Event planning? I know some lovely women who started their own little businesses doing that sort of thing. Little businesses, that sort of thing." Victoria's ability to diminish professional achievements was truly an art form, a talent for making anything that didn't fit her narrow definition of success sound like a hobby that had gotten out of hand. "Cybersecurity," I said simply. Preparing and narrating this type of story took us long efforts and hard work. So if you are enjoying the story, please consider subscribing to our channel. "Cybersecurity?" Victoria repeated the word like it was a foreign language she was trying to pronounce correctly. "Sweetie, that sounds terribly complicated. Are you sure you understand what you're getting into? Those technology jobs require very specific training, and I'd hate for you to be embarrassed if you're not prepared for the technical aspects." Something inside me snapped. Not loudly, not dramatically, but with the quiet finality of a door closing on a room I'd never wanted to enter in the first place. I closed the laptop and looked directly at Victoria for the first time in months. Really looked at her, not with the careful deference I'd been practicing, but with the clear assessment I'd once used to evaluate threats and opportunities in hostile territory. "Victoria," I said quietly, "I spent 3 years protecting classified military communications networks from sophisticated cyber attacks. I have security clearances that most civilian contractors spend decades trying to earn. I've debugged encryption protocols while artillery shells exploded 200 meters away. I think I can handle a business meeting." Victoria blinked, clearly taken aback by my tone. In the months since I'd been home, I'd never contradicted her assessments or challenged her assumptions about my capabilities. I'd absorbed her corrections and accepted her guidance like someone who was grateful for any attention, even when it came wrapped in condescension. "Well," she said, recovering her composure with the practiced grace of someone who was used to maintaining social control, "I'm sure your military experience was very character-building. But civilian business is different, Riley. There are protocols, expectations, ways of presenting yourself that you simply haven't learned yet. I'm trying to help you avoid making mistakes that could damage your father's reputation." There it was. The real concern wasn't about my success or failure. It was about how my choices might reflect on the family brand. Victoria had spent 3 years positioning herself as the curator of the Blackstone image, and my military service didn't fit the narrative she'd been crafting about what kind of family they were. "My father's reputation," I repeated slowly. "The reputation he built by taking risks, by seeing opportunities others missed, by believing that unconventional backgrounds could bring valuable perspectives to traditional industries." Victoria's smile tightened. "That's different. Your father earned his success through decades of hard work and strategic thinking. He didn't just expect people to recognize his potential. He proved it gradually, step by step." I stood up, closing my laptop, with deliberate care. For the first time since coming home, I felt completely calm, like I'd finally found solid ground after months of walking on shifting sand. "Victoria, I'm 28 years old. I've led teams of specialists in life-or-death situations. I've made split-second decisions that affected the safety of hundreds of people. I've earned the respect of some of the most demanding leaders in the world. I'm not going to spend the next decade proving to you that I'm qualified to have a career." The kitchen fell silent except for the soft hum of the refrigerator and the distant sound of lawn mowers working on neighboring properties. Victoria stared at me like I'd suddenly started speaking a language she didn't recognize. "I think you're overreacting," she said finally. "I'm simply trying to guide you toward realistic expectations. There's no shame in starting modestly and building up gradually. Some of the most successful people I know began in entry-level positions. And some of the most successful people you know recognized that experience comes in different forms," I replied. "That leadership skills translate across industries. That maybe, just maybe, 6 years of military service might have prepared me for something more challenging than fetching your dry cleaning." Victoria's face flushed slightly. "I never asked you to fetch my dry cleaning. You asked me to fetch everything else." The truth hung between us like a bridge I'd finally decided to cross. For months, I'd been living in a carefully constructed fiction where I was a grateful family member who was happy to contribute to household management while I figured out my civilian future. But fiction required the cooperation of all participants, and I was done playing my assigned role. Dad appeared in the kitchen doorway, drawn by the unusual energy of raised voices in his normally peaceful home. He looked between Victoria and me, clearly trying to assess what kind of domestic crisis required his attention. "Everything okay in here?" he asked. "Riley is having some unrealistic expectations about career opportunities," Victoria said, automatically turning to Dad for support in managing what she clearly saw as my inappropriate behavior. Dad looked at me, and I saw something in his expression that hadn't been there the night before. Uncertainty about whose version of events to believe. "What kind of career opportunities?" he asked. "The kind that assume I'm qualified to do more than administrative work," I said. "The kind that see military experience as an asset rather than a liability that needs to be overcome." Dad studied my face, and I could see him processing this information through a new framework, one that had been reshuffled by Elena's phone call and my mention of Department of Defense contracts. "Maybe we should talk about this more specifically," he said finally. "What exactly is this meeting about today?" The afternoon meeting with Elena took place in the sleek conference room on the 32nd floor of the Meridian Tower, where floor-to-ceiling windows offered a panoramic view of the city stretching toward the horizon. Elena was already there when I arrived, along with 2 other people she introduced as Marcus Chen, the head of government contracts, and Dr. Sarah Williams, their chief technical officer. Marcus had the bearing of someone who'd spent time in uniform, straight, posture, direct eye contact, and the kind of firm handshake that suggested he was used to assessing people quickly and accurately. Sarah was younger than I'd expected, probably in her early 30s, with the focused intensity of someone who solved complex problems for a living. "Riley," Elena said, gesturing toward a chair at the polished conference table. "I've briefed Marcus and Sarah on your background. We'd like to discuss the Pentagon contract I mentioned yesterday." Marcus opened a folder and slid a document across the table. "The Defense Department is upgrading their secure communication protocols for forward operating bases. They need someone who understands both the technical requirements and the operational realities of implementing new systems in hostile environments." I scanned the document, recognizing immediately the kind of challenges they were describing. "This is about more than just installing new software," I said. "You're talking about changing how field commanders communicate with headquarters while maintaining operational security under combat conditions." Sarah leaned forward. "Exactly. Most cybersecurity consultants understand the technical aspects, but they've never tried to implement new protocols while incoming mortars are disrupting power grids. The timeline is 8 months," Marcus continued. "We need someone who can lead a team of analysts, coordinate with military IT specialists, and develop training protocols that work in real-world conditions. The compensation package starts at $140,000 plus performance bonuses." $140,000. More than Dad had ever paid any of his mid-level managers. More than Victoria spent on her wardrobe each year. But beyond the money, what struck me was how they were describing the role. Not as an entry-level position where I'd prove myself gradually, but as a leadership opportunity that required exactly the skills I'd been developing for 6 years. "When would you need an answer?" I asked. "We're presenting our proposal to the Pentagon next Friday," Elena said. "If you're interested, we'd want to include you in that presentation. Show them that we have someone who can speak their language." I thought about Victoria's assumption that I'd need years of civilian experience before anyone would trust me with significant responsibilities. About Dad's concern that I might not be ready for technical work. About the careful script I'd been following since coming home, the one that positioned me as someone grateful for any opportunity to participate in the adult world. "I'm interested," I said. The next week passed in a blur of preparation that felt more familiar than anything I'd experienced since leaving the military. Elena had given me access to their technical library, and I spent hours reviewing case studies and protocol specifications, rebuilding the mental framework I'd used to analyze complex security challenges. For the first time in months, I was using skills that mattered, solving problems that had real consequences. I set up a workspace in the guest bedroom, covering the walls with flowcharts and system diagrams like I'd once mapped enemy communication networks in Afghanistan. The process was methodical, analytical, the kind of deep focus that made hours pass without notice. This was how I'd always worked best, not following instructions but identifying problems and developing solutions. Dad noticed the change immediately. He'd pause in the doorway when he came home from work, studying the technical documents spread across my desk with something that looked like curiosity. One evening, he knocked on the open door. "What's all this?" he asked, gesturing toward the wall covered in network diagrams. "Security architecture for military communication systems," I said. "I'm analyzing vulnerabilities in current protocols and developing recommendations for improvements." Dad stepped closer, examining the diagrams with the focused attention he usually reserved for his own company's strategic plans. "This is remarkably sophisticated. You developed this analysis yourself? It's based on field experience with similar systems. The theoretical models are useful, but they don't account for operational realities like power outages, equipment failures, or personnel changes during extended deployments." "Personnel changes," Dad repeated. "You mean when people get injured? Or when they don't come back?" "Yes." Dad was quiet for a moment, looking at the diagrams with new understanding. These weren't abstract technical problems. They were life and death challenges that I'd handled under conditions he'd never faced. "How long have you been able to do this kind of analysis?" he asked. "Since my second deployment. The Army sent me to advanced training in network security and threat assessment. I've been developing these skills for 3 years." Dad studied my face like he was seeing me clearly for the first time since I'd come home. "Riley, I had no idea you were working at this level. Why didn't you tell me?" The question hung in the air between us. How could I explain that I'd tried to tell him, but that every conversation about my military experience had been redirected toward discussions about adjustment and transition? That Victoria's constant emphasis on starting small and building gradually had made it seem like my actual qualifications were irrelevant to civilian career planning? "I guess I thought you already knew," I said finally. The Pentagon presentation was scheduled for Thursday morning in a secure conference room at the Department of Defense. Elena had arranged for me to participate via encrypted video conference, partly for security clearance reasons and partly to demonstrate our team's capability for remote collaboration. Wednesday night, I spread my presentation materials across the dining room table, practicing the technical briefing one final time. Victoria found me there around 10 o'clock, reviewing classified protocol specifications that I wasn't allowed to discuss, but that represented months of analytical work. "Still working on your little project?" she asked, settling into the chair, across from me with a cup of herbal tea. Little project. Even now, facing evidence of the scope and complexity of what I was doing, Victoria couldn't quite let go of the narrative that positioned my work as something modest and temporary. It's a Defense Department contract proposal, I said. Not exactly little. Victoria glanced at the documents spread across the table, clearly unable to interpret the technical diagrams and security classifications. Well, I hope it works out. Dear. But remember, even if this particular opportunity doesn't lead anywhere, it's still valuable experience. You're learning how to present yourself professionally, how to interact with business people. That's all good preparation for whatever comes next. I looked at her across the table, realizing that she genuinely couldn't see what was happening. To Victoria, this was still a learning experience, a chance for me to practice being taken seriously rather than an opportunity where I was actually being taken seriously. What if it does lead somewhere? I asked. Victoria smiled indulgently. Then we'll cross that bridge when we come to it. But let's not get ahead of ourselves. Thursday morning arrived with the weight of anticipation that made my hands steady rather than nervous. The Pentagon presentation was scheduled for 11 o'clock, and I'd been awake since 5, reviewing my technical briefing materials one final time. The encrypted video conference would connect me directly to the Defense Department's procurement board, where I'd be presenting alongside Elena's team as the lead analyst for their cybersecurity proposal. I was adjusting my blazer in the hallway, mirror when Dad emerged from his home office, carrying his briefcase and wearing the distracted expression he reserved for particularly demanding days at Blackstone Technologies. He paused when he saw me, taking in my professional attire with something that looked like surprise. "You look official," he said. "Is this for that consulting meeting you mentioned?" "The Pentagon presentation," I reminded him. "The Defense Department contract we discussed." Dad nodded slowly, but I could see him struggling to connect the person standing in front of him with the gravity of what I was about to do. "Right. Well, good luck with that. I'm sure it will be a valuable learning experience." Learning experience. The same phrase Victoria had been using for weeks, as if serious professional opportunities were essentially educational field trips designed to teach me how the adult world functioned. Victoria appeared from the kitchen, carrying her usual morning smoothie and wearing tennis whites for her weekly doubles match at the country club. She looked me up and down with the critical assessment she usually reserved for charity gala outfits. "Very professional, dear," she said approvingly. "Though you might want to consider softer makeup for future business meetings. The military look is a bit intense for civilian environments." The military look. As if 6 years of service had left me with some kind of permanent aesthetic deficiency that needed correction before I could be trusted in polite society. "Actually," Dad said, glancing at his watch, "I should mention something. We're having lunch today with the Hendersons and the Michaels at the yacht club. Victoria thought it would be nice for you to join us, maybe meet some people who could help with networking opportunities." I stared at him. "I can't. I have the Pentagon presentation at 11, and there's a debrief scheduled immediately afterward." Victoria's expression shifted to the patient disappointment she used when explaining obvious social priorities to people who were being deliberately obtuse. "Sweetie, you can reschedule a phone call. This lunch has been planned for weeks, and these are exactly the kind of connections that could open doors for you. The Hendersons own 3 restaurants, and Janet Michael runs the nonprofit that coordinates veteran support programs. Real opportunities. Real opportunities. Restaurant management and nonprofit coordination, presented as if they were more substantial than a Defense Department contract worth several $1,000,000. "I can't reschedule the Pentagon," I said carefully. "This isn't a phone call, Victoria. It's a formal contract presentation to Defense Department procurement officials." Dad looked confused, like I was describing something that didn't quite fit his understanding of how these things worked. "Surely they'd understand that you have prior family commitments. Business people are generally flexible about scheduling conflicts." The assumption behind his words was staggering, that the United States Department of Defense would accommodate my family's social calendar. That a formal contract presentation involving national security could be treated like a casual business meeting that could be moved around for more convenient timing. "Dad," I said slowly. This is the Pentagon. They don't reschedule presentations because someone has lunch plans. Victoria set down her smoothie with the sharp click of glass against granite. Riley, I think you're taking this a bit too seriously. It's wonderful that you're exploring opportunities, but you need to maintain perspective. Family comes first, and these connections could lead to real career advancement. You can't afford to burn bridges over one meeting. Burn bridges. Maintain perspective. Every phrase was designed to minimize what I was doing, to reframe it as an amateur mistake rather than a professional priority. Besides, Victoria continued, wouldn't it be better to start with something more accessible? Janet Michael's nonprofit works with veterans transitioning to civilian careers. She could probably help you find something appropriate, maybe administrative, work or event coordination. Build up your resume gradually. There it was again. Building up gradually, starting with something appropriate, as if my current qualifications were insufficient for anything beyond entry-level positions that required supervision and on-the-job training. My phone buzzed with a text from Elena. Conference room secured. Technical team standing by. Looking. Forward to showing Pentagon officials what real expertise looks like. I looked at Dad and Victoria, both of them waiting for me to acknowledge that they were right, that family lunch obligations obviously took precedence over Defense Department contracts, that I was being unrealistic about the importance of what I was doing. I'm not rescheduling, I said quietly. Victoria's smile faltered. Excuse me? I'm not missing a Pentagon presentation to have lunch at the yacht club. I'm not introducing myself to Janet Michael as someone who needs help finding appropriate work. I'm not starting over with administrative positions to prove that I can handle civilian employment. Dad stepped forward, clearly uncomfortable with the tension that was building in the foyer. Riley, nobody's asking you to start over. We're just suggesting that you be strategic about building professional relationships. Strategic, I repeated, like turning down a Defense Department contract to make small talk with restaurant owners. It's not about turning down anything, Victoria said, her voice taking on the sharp edge she used when her authority was being questioned. It's about understanding your place and making smart choices about your future. You can't just expect people to take you seriously without earning their respect first. Earning respect. As if I hadn't earned anything during 6 years of military service. As if the Pentagon's invitation to present had been extended out of charity rather than recognition of my qualifications. My place, I said, testing the words. And where exactly? Is my place, Victoria? She blinked, clearly not expecting the question to be turned back on her so directly. Your place is with family, supporting the people who care about you, being grateful for the opportunities you've been given. What opportunities have I been given? I asked. The foyer fell completely silent. Victoria stared at me like I'd asked a question in a foreign language, while Dad shifted uncomfortably beside her, clearly wishing this conversation was happening anywhere but in his front hallway. The opportunity to live here while you figure things out, Victoria said finally. The opportunity to meet the right people, to learn how things work in the civilian world. The opportunity to be part of a family that values stability and responsibility. And, in exchange for these opportunities, I clean your house, run your errands, and turn down professional contracts to attend your social events. Victoria's face flushed. That's a very ungrateful way to characterize what we've been trying to do for you. I picked up my briefcase and car keys, feeling calmer than I'd felt in months. What you've been trying to do is keep me small enough to fit into your idea of what I should be, but I'm done fitting into other people's ideas. Dad reached out as if to stop me. Riley, where are you going? To represent a cybersecurity consulting firm in a Defense Department contract presentation, I said, because that's what I'm qualified to do, whether you understand it or not. The drive to Meridian Tower felt like traveling between two different worlds. Behind me was the Blackstone estate, where my family was probably discussing my inappropriate behavior over breakfast, lamenting my inability to understand social priorities. Ahead was the 32nd floor conference room where Pentagon officials were waiting to evaluate a cybersecurity proposal that could reshape how the military protected critical communications in hostile environments. Elena met me at the elevator, her expression focused but confident. The technical team is already connected. General Morrison and his procurement board are joining from the Pentagon at exactly 1100 hours. They've reviewed our preliminary materials, and they specifically requested to hear from our field operations specialist. Not former military trying to transition into civilian work, not someone building up experience gradually, someone whose expertise was essential to the project's success. The conference room was set up like a command center, with multiple screens displaying network diagrams, threat assessment matrices, and implementation timelines. Marcus and Sarah were already seated at the polished table, surrounded by tablets and technical documentation. At exactly 11 o'clock, the main screen came alive with the secure video connection from Washington. General Morrison appeared on screen, flanked by 2 colonels and a civilian procurement officer. His uniform bore the kind of ribbons that indicated decades of service in increasingly complex leadership roles. When he looked directly into the camera, I felt the familiar recognition that passed between military professionals who understood the weight of operational responsibility. "Ms. Blackstone," he said, his voice clear despite the encrypted connection, "I've reviewed your service record and technical certifications. Impressive work in Kandahar on the communication security upgrades. Colonel Patterson speaks highly of your analytical capabilities." Colonel Patterson, my former commanding officer, someone I hadn't spoken to in months but who'd apparently recommended me for this opportunity. The realization that my military network was still advocating for me felt like discovering an anchor I'd forgotten I had. "Thank you, sir. That project taught me a lot about implementing theoretical security protocols under real-world conditions. Which brings us to our current challenge," General Morrison continued. "We need communication systems that can maintain security integrity while adapting to rapidly changing operational requirements. Your preliminary analysis identified vulnerabilities that our current contractors missed entirely." Elena leaned forward. Riley's approach combines traditional cybersecurity protocols with tactical flexibility. She understands that the best technical solution is worthless if it can't function when mortars are disrupting power grids or when personnel are operating under extreme stress. For the next 40 minutes, I found myself in the kind of detailed technical discussion I'd been craving since leaving the military. General Morrison asked probing questions about encryption methodologies, backup communication protocols, and training requirements for field implementation. His questions weren't designed to test whether I understood the basics. They assumed competence and pushed toward the complex strategic thinking that separated consultants from experts. "The current system requires 17 minutes for full security authentication," I explained, pulling up a flowchart on the shared screen. "Under combat conditions, that's often 17 minutes troops don't have. My proposal streamlines the process to under 3 minutes while actually increasing security through distributed verification protocols." Colonel Hayes, one of the officers, flanking General Morrison, leaned closer to his camera. "You've tested these protocols under simulated combat conditions. I've implemented similar systems during live operations in Afghanistan. The theoretical models work, but they need adjustment for operational realities like communication blackouts, equipment failures, and personnel changes during extended missions." General Morrison nodded slowly. "Ms. Blackstone, your technical analysis is exactly what we've been looking for. But I need to ask directly, are you prepared to lead implementation training for field commanders? This isn't a desk job. You'd be working directly with units preparing for deployment." "Yes, sir. That's exactly the kind of work I want to be doing." The screen went quiet for a moment while the Pentagon team conferred off-camera. When General Morrison returned, his expression had shifted to something that looked like decision-making. "Maid, Elena, your team's proposal is accepted. We're authorizing a 12-month contract worth $4.2 million. Ms. Blackstone will serve as lead technical consultant with the option to extend based on implementation success. $4.2 million. Lead technical consultant. The numbers and titles felt surreal, but also completely logical given the scope and complexity of what we'd been discussing. After the Pentagon team disconnected, Elena turned to face me with a smile that looked like victory. Congratulations, partner. Partner. Not employee, not junior consultant, not someone building up experience gradually. Partner in a multi-million-dollar Defense Department contract. My phone had been buzzing intermittently during the presentation, and I finally glanced at the screen. 7 missed calls from Victoria, 3 from Dad, and a series of increasingly urgent text messages. Victoria. Where are you? The Hendersons are asking about you. Dad. We need to discuss your attitude this morning. Call me. Victoria. This is extremely embarrassing. I had to make excuses for your absence. Dad. Riley, you're making a mistake. These connections matter for your future. I showed the messages to Elena, who read them with an expression that shifted from confusion to something that looked like anger. They think you're missing lunch for a phone call, she said. They think I'm being dramatic about career opportunities that aren't realistic for someone with my background. Elena stared at me for a long moment. Riley, do you realize what just happened? The Pentagon just awarded your team a contract that most consulting firms spend years trying to land. You're about to become one of the youngest lead consultants on a Defense Department cybersecurity project. I realize it, I said. I'm just not sure my family will. Marcus, who'd been quietly packing up his presentation materials, looked up. Are you planning to tell them? The question hung in the air like a challenge. For months, I'd been living in their world, accepting their assessment of my capabilities, allowing them to position me as someone who needed guidance and management. But sitting in this conference room, surrounded by evidence of what I was actually qualified to accomplish, that narrative felt like a costume I'd finally outgrown. I'm planning to show them, I said. Elena smiled. How? I thought about Dad's assumption that I wasn't ready for technical work, about Victoria's suggestion that I start with administrative positions and build up gradually, about their complete inability to understand that a Pentagon presentation might be more important than yacht club networking, by living like the person I actually am instead of the person they think I should be. The drive back to the Blackstone estate felt different this time, like I was returning as a guest rather than a resident who needed permission to exist in the space. The contract documents sat in my briefcase on the passenger seat. Official. Pentagon letterhead. Signature pages that made me a lead consultant on a multi-million-dollar cybersecurity project. But more than the paperwork, I carried something I hadn't felt in months. The quiet confidence that came from being valued for exactly who I was. Victoria's Mercedes was in the driveway when I pulled up, which meant she'd returned from her yacht club lunch early. Probably to discuss my inappropriate behavior with Dad, to strategize about how to manage my unrealistic expectations about career opportunities. I could picture them in his home office, Victoria explaining how my military experience had given me an inflated sense of my own capabilities, Dad nodding along while reviewing quarterly reports that required his actual attention. I found them exactly where I'd imagined. Dad behind his mahogany desk, Victoria in the leather chair across from him, both of them looking up when I appeared in the doorway with the expression of parents who'd been waiting to address a teenager's behavioral problems. There you are, Victoria said, her voice carrying the carefully controlled disappointment she used when someone had failed to meet basic social expectations. We need to discuss what happened this morning. Dad gestured toward the empty chair beside Victoria. Sit down, Riley. We're concerned about some of the choices you've been making lately. I remained standing, briefcase in hand, feeling calmer than I'd felt since returning home. What choices are you concerned about? Victoria straightened in her chair, adopting the posture she used for delivering charitable board presentations to audiences who needed education about proper priorities. Your attitude this morning was completely inappropriate. We had plans, commitments to people who matter in this community. You can't just decide that your personal projects take precedence over family obligations. Personal projects. Even now, she couldn't acknowledge that I'd been doing anything more substantial than hobby-level activity that could be rescheduled around social conveniences. What exactly do you think I was doing today? I asked. Dad leaned forward, clearly preferring direct questions to the emotional tension that had been building between Victoria and me. Some kind of consulting meeting, right? Look, Riley, we understand that you want to explore career options, but you need to be realistic about building professional relationships gradually. The Hendersons have connections throughout the restaurant industry, and Janet Michael could introduce you to nonprofit organizations that specifically help veterans transition to civilian work. Transition to civilian work, as if everything I'd accomplished during 6 years of military service was irrelevant preparation for joining the adult workforce. Dad, I said quietly, what do you know about my military service record? The question seemed to catch him off guard. I know you served honorably, 3 deployments, I think, and you received some kind of commendation for bravery. A Purple Heart for taking shrapnel while evacuating wounded civilians from a compound under enemy. Fire, I said. But that's not what I'm asking about. What do you know about my technical qualifications? Dad glanced at Victoria, clearly uncomfortable with the direction of the conversation. I know the military gave you training in various areas. Technology, communications, that sort of thing. 6 years of specialized cybersecurity education, advanced certifications in network analysis and threat assessment, leadership experience managing teams of technical specialists, all reduced to that sort of thing because it didn't fit his framework for understanding career preparation. I opened my briefcase and placed the Pentagon contract on his desk. The official seal of the Department of Defense was visible at the top of the first page, along with my name listed as lead technical consultant. This is what I was doing today, I said. The United States Department of Defense just awarded our team a $4.2 million contract to upgrade cybersecurity protocols for military communication systems. I'm the lead analyst. Dad stared at the document like it was written in a foreign language. Victoria leaned forward to peer at the pages, her expression shifting from confident correction to something that looked like confusion. $4.2 million? Dad repeated slowly. The Pentagon specifically requested me for this project because of my field experience implementing security protocols under combat conditions. General Morrison said my technical analysis identified vulnerabilities that their current contractors had missed entirely. Victoria picked up one of the contract pages, studying it with the intensity she usually reserved for charity fundraising budgets. This is a real government contract? As real as your yacht club memberships, I said. More real than restaurant industry connections or nonprofit networking opportunities. Dad was reading through the technical specifications, his expression changing as he processed the scope and complexity of what I'd be managing. Riley, this is senior-level consulting work. This is the kind of contract that established firms compete for. Elena Vasquez's firm competed for it, I said. And they won because they had me? The office fell completely silent, except for the soft tick of Dad's desk clock and the distant sound of lawnmowers working on neighboring properties. Victoria was still holding the contract pages, reading through procurement language and technical requirements that clearly exceeded her expectations about what I was qualified to handle. Why didn't you tell us you were working at this level? Dad asked finally. The question hung between us like a bridge I'd been waiting months to cross. How could I explain that I'd tried to tell them, but that every conversation about my military experience had been redirected toward discussions about adjustment and transition? That Victoria's constant emphasis on starting small and building gradually had made it seem like my actual qualifications were irrelevant to civilian career planning? I tried to tell you, I said. But every time I mentioned my technical background, you suggested I start with administrative work and build up gradually. Every time I talked about my leadership experience, Victoria recommended entry-level positions that would teach me how civilian businesses operate. Victoria set the contract pages back on Dad's desk with careful precision. We were trying to help you manage expectations. The transition from military to civilian careers is challenging for most veterans. Most veterans don't have top-secret security clearances and 3 years of advanced cybersecurity training, I said. Most veterans haven't spent years protecting classified communication networks from sophisticated cyber attacks. Dad looked at me like he was seeing someone he'd never met before. Riley, if you have these qualifications, why have you been cleaning your house? I finished. Running Victoria's errands? Because you both assumed that's what I was qualified for, and I was so grateful to be included in your lives that I convinced myself you were probably right. Victoria's face flushed slightly. We never asked you to clean our house. You offered to help with household management, because you made it clear that was the only way I could contribute meaningfully to this family. Every other suggestion I made was dismissed as unrealistic or inappropriate for someone with my background. Dad was still studying the contract, apparently trying to reconcile the person described in these official documents with the daughter he'd been treating like a recent college graduate who needed guidance about basic career decisions. Elena Vasquez recommended you for this position? He asked. Elena Vasquez recruited me for this position. She said Blackstone Technologies needed someone who could think like an adversary rather than just building bigger walls. Dad's head snapped up. Blackstone Technologies? This contract is with my company? I smiled for the first time since entering his office. No, Dad. This contract is with Elena Vasquez's company. She left Blackstone Technologies 6 months ago to start her own cybersecurity consulting firm, and yesterday she offered me a partnership. The news spread through Dad's professional network faster than I'd expected. Within 2 days of the Pentagon announcement, his phone was ringing with calls from industry contacts who'd heard that Elena Vasquez had landed a major Defense Department contract with a consulting team that included Richard Blackstone's daughter. The irony wasn't lost on anyone. Elena had recruited talent that Dad hadn't recognized in his own house. Marcus Chen called me Thursday evening with an update that felt like watching dominoes fall in slow motion. The Defense Department is so impressed with our preliminary analysis that they're fast-tracking 2 additional contract opportunities. Both projects specifically request you as lead consultant. We're talking about another $8 million in revenue over the next 18 months. $8 million. Elena's firm was positioning itself to become a major player in government cybersecurity consulting, and I was apparently the strategic advantage they'd been looking for. The phone calls from other firms started arriving Friday morning. Headhunters who'd gotten my name from Pentagon sources, CEOs who wanted to understand how a newly discharged veteran had become the most sought-after cybersecurity consultant in the defense industry. Dad found me in the guest bedroom Saturday morning, surrounded by contract offers and partnership proposals from companies I'd only read about in industry publications. He knocked on the open door with the tentative courtesy of someone who wasn't sure of his welcome anymore. Can we talk? He asked. I gestured toward the chair across from my makeshift desk. He sat down carefully, taking in the scattered documents, with something that looked like awe mixed with confusion. I've been getting calls, he said. People want to know how I managed to raise a daughter who became a cybersecurity expert without anyone in the industry knowing about it. What do you tell them? Dad was quiet for a long moment, studying his hands. I tell them I'm still figuring that out myself. He picked up one of the contract offers, scanning the compensation package with the focused attention he usually reserved for his own company's strategic planning. North Point Systems is offering you a senior director position, with a starting salary of $200,000, plus equity. I'm not taking it, I said. Because the money isn't enough? Because I already have a partnership with Elena. We're building something together. Dad set the contract aside and looked at me directly. Riley, I owe you an apology. Several apologies, actually. I spent so much time thinking about how to help you transition to civilian life that I never bothered to understand what you'd already accomplished. The acknowledgement felt like something I'd been waiting years to hear, but it also felt incomplete. It wasn't just transition advice, Dad. You and Victoria treated me like someone who needed to be managed rather than someone who could contribute. Victoria feels terrible about the misunderstanding, Dad said, though his tone suggested Victoria's feelings were more complicated than simple regret. Is that what we're calling it? A misunderstanding? Dad shifted uncomfortably in his chair. She's been talking to some of her friends about veteran support programs. She wants to get involved, maybe help other military families navigate civilian career transitions more effectively. The image of Victoria leading seminars about supporting veterans was almost surreal. Does she understand that most veterans don't need support programs? They need employers who recognize that military experience is valuable preparation for civilian leadership? She's learning, Dad said. We both are. My phone rang, interrupting our conversation. Elena's name appeared on the screen, and I felt the familiar surge of energy that came with calls from someone who valued my expertise. Elena, what's the update? Riley, I just got off a call with Senator Martinez's office. She chairs the Armed Services Committee, and she wants to meet with you about developing cybersecurity standards for all Defense Department contractors. This could reshape how the entire industry approaches military consulting. When does she want to meet? Next week in Washington. And Riley? She specifically mentioned that she'd been following your career through Pentagon sources. You're developing quite a reputation. After I hung up, Dad was staring at me with an expression I'd never seen before. Not the polite concern he'd shown for months, but something that looked like genuine respect. Senator Martinez? He asked. She wants to discuss policy recommendations for cybersecurity standards across all Defense Department contracts. Dad leaned back in his chair, apparently trying to process the scope of what I was telling him. Riley, do you realize what this means? If you're influencing federal cybersecurity policy, you're essentially setting standards that every company in our industry will have to follow. Including Blackstone Technologies, I said. The implication hung between us like a bridge neither of us had expected to cross. 6 months ago, I'd been fetching coffee for Dad's business meetings. Now I was potentially setting federal standards that his company would need to comply with. I've been thinking, Dad said slowly. Blackstone Technologies could use a cybersecurity consultant. Someone who understands both military requirements and civilian implementation. Someone who could help us compete for the kind of contracts we've been losing to firms like Elena's. I studied his face, looking for signs of the condescension that had characterized our conversations for months. Instead, I saw something that looked like a business proposal from one professional to another. Are you offering me a job, Dad? I'm offering you a consulting contract. Market rates, full autonomy over cybersecurity strategy, partnership track if the results justify it. The offer was everything I might have wanted 6 months ago. Recognition from Dad, a place in his company, validation that my skills were valuable. But sitting in that guest bedroom, surrounded by evidence of what I'd built independently, it felt like an opportunity I'd already outgrown. Thank you, I said. But I'm not looking for a place in your company anymore. Dad nodded slowly, and I could see him processing what that meant. Because you're building your own. Because I already built my own. 3 months later, I was sitting in my new office on the 28th floor of Harbor Plaza, watching the morning sun reflect off the water beyond the city skyline. The nameplate on my desk read, Riley Blackstone, Senior Partner, and behind me hung the framed Pentagon contract that had started everything, not as a trophy, but as a reminder of what happened when people finally saw you clearly. Elena knocked on my open door, carrying 2 cups of coffee and wearing the satisfied expression of someone who'd just closed another major deal. North Point Systems wants to discuss a joint venture, Apparently, they've decided they can't compete with us, so they'd rather partner with us. The same North Point that offered me a director position last month? The very same. They're offering Elena Vasquez Consulting a $20 million partnership deal with you as the lead strategist for all government contracts. $20 million. The number still felt surreal, but it also felt earned. Our firm had grown from Elena's startup vision to a major player in cybersecurity consulting, largely because we'd proven that military experience wasn't just valuable. It was essential for understanding how security systems needed to function in real-world conditions. "Any word from Senator Martinez's office?" Elena asked, settling into the chair across from my desk. "The cybersecurity standards proposal passed committee yesterday. Full Senate vote next week. The legislation I'd helped draft would require all Defense Department contractors to demonstrate field-tested security protocols, essentially making military experience a prerequisite for major government consulting contracts. That's going to reshape the entire industry," Elena said. "Companies, like your father's, will need to hire veterans or partner with firms that understand operational requirements." Dad had been calling regularly since the legislation gained momentum, not to offer family advice or express concern about my attitude, but to discuss business strategy and ask for professional guidance. The shift in our relationship felt like waking up from a long dream where I'd convinced myself I was smaller than I actually was. Victoria had surprised everyone by enrolling in a veteran support certification program and volunteering with organizations that helped military families navigate civilian career transitions. She'd called last week to ask for my input on a workshop she was developing about recognizing transferable military skills. "I think I owe you more than an apology," she'd said during that conversation. "I think I owe you recognition that I was wrong about almost everything." The acknowledgement felt like forgiveness, but it also felt like something I no longer needed. The person who'd been hurt by Victoria's assumptions had evolved into someone who was too busy building meaningful work to carry old resentments. My phone buzzed with a text from Marcus Chen. "General Morrison's office called. They want to discuss a special project involving NATO cybersecurity coordination. Congratulations, you're officially an international consultant. NATO coordination." 6 months ago, I'd been folding napkins for family dinner parties. Now I was being recruited to help protect communication systems for military alliances that spanned continents. Elena finished her coffee and stood up, pausing at my office door. "You know what the best part of all this is?" "The money?" I suggested, though we both knew that wasn't really the answer. "The fact that you never tried to prove them wrong. You just proved yourself right." That afternoon, I drove back to the Blackstone estate to pick up the last of my belongings. I'd found an apartment closer to the office, a space that felt like mine rather than like temporary lodging in someone else's life. Dad met me in the driveway, helping carry boxes to my car with the careful attention of someone who was trying to rebuild a relationship he'd nearly lost. "I've been thinking about what you said," he told me as we loaded the final box, "about how I assumed you needed guidance instead of recognizing what you could contribute." "It's okay, Dad. We figured it out." "No, it's not okay. I spent so much time thinking about your transition to civilian life that I never asked what you wanted your civilian life to look like." He paused, leaning against my car. "I treated you like someone who needed to be fixed instead of someone who was already whole." The observation was more perceptive than I'd expected, and more generous than our relationship had earned. We all make assumptions about people we think we know. The difference is, my assumptions cost us time we can't get back. Your mother would have been proud of what you've accomplished, but she would have been disappointed in how long it took me to see it. My mother. Dad rarely mentioned her anymore, but when he did, it was usually to acknowledge something he felt he'd failed to live up to. She would have understood that people need time to grow into who they're supposed to be. "Even parents," Dad said quietly. As I drove away from the estate, I caught sight of Dad in my rearview mirror, standing in the driveway watching me leave. not with the concern of someone worried about my ability to manage independently, but with the respect of someone watching a peer head off to handle important business. The girl who'd come home from Afghanistan 6 months ago had been looking for a place to fit into someone else's vision of success. The woman driving toward Harbor Plaza understood that the most important victories weren't about proving other people wrong, but about building something so undeniably right that recognition became inevitable. My phone rang as I pulled into the parking garage. Elena's voice came through the car speakers with news that felt like the perfect punctuation to the day. Riley, I just got confirmation. Elena Vasquez Consulting has been selected as the primary cybersecurity contractor for the new Veterans Administration. Digital Security Overhaul. It's a 5-year contract worth $47 million. $47 million. Working to protect the digital infrastructure that served the veterans who'd taught me everything I knew about courage, dedication, and refusing to accept limitations that other people tried to impose. When do we start? I asked. We already started, Elena said, the moment you decided to stop hiding. 2 years later, I was standing on the stage at the National Defense Industry Conference, delivering a keynote speech about cybersecurity innovation to an audience of 3,000 military and corporate leaders. In the front row sat General me, Morrison, Elena, and Dad, all 3 of them watching with the kind of attention reserved for people whose opinions actually mattered. The greatest security vulnerability in any system, I told the audience, isn't technological. It's the assumption that potential can only look one way, that expertise can only come from traditional sources. The moment we stop underestimating unconventional talent is the moment we become truly secure. After my speech, a young veteran approached me backstage. She was maybe 25, still wearing her dress uniform, uncertainty written across her face like a question she hadn't learned to ask yet. Ma'am, I'm transitioning out next month. Everyone keeps telling me I need to start small, build up gradually. But I designed communication systems for special operations. I feel like I'm more qualified than they think I am. I looked at her the IG way Elena had looked at me that day in Meridian Cafe, like someone who saw exactly what was standing in front of her. You are, I said simply. And the right people will recognize that. Your job isn't to make yourself smaller so others feel comfortable. Your job is to be so undeniably excellent that they have no choice but to see you clearly. She smiled, and I could see something shift in her posture, the same shift that had happened to me when I finally stopped apologizing for taking up space I'd already earned. Sometimes the loudest victory is refusing to whisper. If this story resonated with you, if you've ever had to prove your worth to people who should have seen it from the beginning, hit that subscribe button. Your story matters, and this channel is here to remind you that you're not alone in building something bigger than other people's expectations.